I remember being in a march one day with a whole lot of primarily undocumented workers, and I remember turning a particular corner and being confronted by the LAPD in full riot gear on very large horses.
Hi, and welcome to another year of Socially Democratic. Today we're talking to Senator Jess Walsh, whose long history of organising begins in Los Angeles in the 1990s and continues today in the halls of our federal parliament. I can't wait to share this fascinating conversation with you, but first, here's a nod from our sponsors. The presenting sponsor for Socially Democratic is Dunn. Dunn is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people who want to build power to make the world a better place. And if you want to create change in 2025, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. A special shout out to all of our Patreon members as well. And you can join our community for free or for as little as $1.50 a month. And you too can help support this podcast. All paid members receive a welcome gift. So if you have recently signed up, please check your inbox for a message from our producer asking for your shipping address, because without that, then we can't send you your merch. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn has been fighting for workers' rights in Australia for more than 100 years. They believe the law should serve everyone and not just those that can afford it. So for empathetic and expert legal support, call Maurice Blackburn Lawyers today. All right, let's get on with today's episode. We are taping this one on a Wednesday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And joining us on the line now is the former Victorian Branch Secretary of United Voice, or formerly known as the LHMU, but she's now a senator for the great state of Victoria, and it's wonderful to welcome her on the podcast for the very first time. Senator Jess Walsh, welcome to Socially Democratic.
G'day, thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about a particular campaign on today's episode, the Big Steps campaign that you played a pretty big part in, both as a union leader but also on the parliamentary side of our Labor movement. But before we get into that, I always like to just, particularly with our newer guests who have been on the show for the first time, just find out a bit more about yourself and your own background. And I'm curious as to know what led you into the path of working at a trade union. Where did that passion for the union movement or supporting working people come from?
Yeah, so it really came from me deciding to leave Australia when I was in my early 20s and go overseas and live in Los Angeles in the US. I did a master's degree over there, and I hadn't been particularly politically active before that, or involved in the Labor movement before that, but I was one of those postgraduate students that spent a lot of time working late at the university, and I started talking to the cleaners, or janitors as they are called over in the US, and they'd started getting involved in a big and famous union campaign called the Justice for Janitors campaign, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, and quite a few listeners will be familiar with. At the time that I was there, it had successfully organised city cleaners in Los Angeles, and the next target of the campaign really was the university that I was at, the University of Southern California, and I got involved at that time as a student supporting the cleaners, and found myself being an early member of what became a Student Labour Action Committee sort of movement, and found myself really actively involved in supporting the cleaners to get a better deal with the university.
How the hell did you end up going to university over in the United States? Because I want to hear these stories. I get jealous and I want to have a time machine and go back, because no one ever told me that I could do that when I was piss-farting around at La Trobe University. I would have killed to have gone to a uni in the United States. I just didn't know that was possible. How the hell did that happen?
Well, I did pretty well in my honours year at uni. Maybe while you were piss-farting around at La Trobe.
There's a sliding doors moment happening here, I can see. Yeah.
I had my head in the books, and I remember my honours supervisor had come from North America, and he said, I think you're good at this. Do you want to think about doing this? And I had a scholarship because obviously you pay fees at US universities, and I worked my way through it. I worked 20 hours a week doing teaching and research work over there, and it was an awesome experience. There were lots of people from around the world who came to do the same thing, and really all of us connected around this particular campaign as well. Yeah.
How did you come across the campaign? Like you said, you were working late hours talking to some of the janitors, but explain to me the motivation to actually get involved.
I think definitely the personal connection of having the cleaner that I knew who, they come late at night, that's when you see them, telling me his story. And I remember him pretty well. A lot of the cleaners were from Mexico and Central America. Actually, this guy was an African-American guy. And he was working full time and not making enough to support himself, as he wanted to and with his family. And I guess it was also a pretty exciting campaign. The campaign was known for really being very activist, very led by the members. Loud and proud, and I and other students, we found ourselves, supporting the cleaners by going on these big noisy protests. I remember being in a march one day with a whole lot of primarily undocumented workers, people who were not only from Mexico and Central America, but didn't have the proper papers, and if they were arrested, they faced deportation. And I remember being in this march, and it was very sort of early on and still literally finding my own voice in feeling confident to do that kind of protest, which for people who know me now will, find odd that I ever sort of found it a bit weird and uncomfortable, but the first time you do, it's pretty weird and uncomfortable doing that sort of protest.
Can I interrupt there, Jess? Why did you find that weird and uncomfortable? What was the uncomfortableness for you?
I think just the yelling, being on the street and yelling was not something that I'd done. As I say, I hadn't been an activist before. And, I was standing with these people who were, standing up for themselves, standing up for their rights, speaking out. And I remember turning a particular corner. I can visualize it. It was a long time ago now, but I remember literally turning a corner and with these cleaners and being confronted by the LAPD in full riot gear on very large horses. And I remember thinking various expletives at the time, and then these cleaners just kind of marching forward, and many of them, being arrested. And as I said, a lot of them were undocumented people, and they had tremendous courage, and they were willing to take pretty big risk to stand up for themselves, all in the effort of just having a decent job that paid them enough to support their family. And I just thought at that moment, that's what I want to do. This is where I want to be.
It's funny how sometimes you can find courage from the courage of others. I remember being on a pickup line in Darwin at Darwin Airport, where a bunch of workers who were working for Gate Gourmet, which is a US-based catering company. I don't know if I've spoken about this before on the show, but the TW were in negotiations with a company for over. It was getting to the point almost 2 years, and they'd changed their wage office of like a 1% wage increase to a 0% wage increase, to the point when you are having a laugh. So we eventually had protected action, and we locked up the gate, and the courage from. I mean, most of these workers were similar to what you're talking about, migrant women from Southeast Asia that were working for Gate Gourmet, and the courage that they were showing on that picket line It made me think, well, geez, Stephen, I mean, your life's pretty straightforward. You could probably easily stand with these people, and there's a truck right in front of us trying to push through. I don't know. There was a very seminal moment in my own union career when I think back on it in that bloody wet season in Darwin. Yuck. So you've stepped up to the plate, so to speak, to use a baseball analogy, and you've had this moment. What did you do next? Like, where did you go to give more to this particular campaign?
I think in that period of my 20s, I spent a fair amount of time, trying to figure out, what I wanted to do. The campaign, resolved eventually. There was an agreement with the university. I went on and moved to the East Coast there. So I started a PhD back at Melbourne University, but I took a couple of years of it on the East Coast. Did a year at the Economic Policy Institute in Washington as well. Got involved again in the labour movement while I was living on the East Coast. And I came back really with the decision at that point about, well, am I going to continue down this sort of academic path that I've invested in, or am I going to sort of put it into action and put what I've learned while I've been studying by engaging with the US labour movement into action. I did have one of those real sliding door moments between two job opportunities, one with what is now the United Workers Union, but you were right, was the LHMU at the time, and the other continuing on the academic path, doing lecturing in the field. It took a bit of time to make that decision in that sort of, late 20s approach that you can have, where it can be hard to see where you're going. Chose to work with the union, and by far the best work decision I've ever made in my life to do that.
So why did you choose the union? What was the thing you think in the end that made you tip towards working in the labour movement?
Probably didn't know how hard a slog it was going to be when I signed up for it. I think just going back to wanting to live a life of service and engagement, really. I think the union movement gets a rough, a bit of the rough end of the stick, particularly, from Liberal politicians, coalition politicians, parts of the media, but it is fundamentally a place of service to others, and a whole lot of very good people get up every day, literally to try to help other people build good, secure jobs in their life. And I think, for us as a country, good, secure jobs that pay enough to live and to support yourself and others are the foundation of our country, really. And it's incredibly important work. It's purposeful work. And, I had some of the very best years of my life working there, which I did up until nominating for the Senate in 2019.
What year did you go into the union movement here in Australia?
I think it was 2002. It was definitely the early 2000s. Yeah.
Paint a picture for us that what was it like going into working in the trade union movement in that time? I was thinking to my second year at the SDA at that time, so I'm interested in getting your own reflections on what it looked like for you.
Well, it was a very rough time for the union movement. It was, several years after John Howard had come in, with a purpose to dismantle the union movement and the supports of the union movement as it was structured at the time. People of roughly our generation, will remember that time. And the Workplace Relations Act, I think it was, of 1996, just to give the young folks the history lesson, which started to dismantle the award system and started to dismantle closed shops. And when I came into LHMU as it was then. I think we had not yet grappled with all of that. We were still getting hit with decline. We were losing members because there'd been sort of arrangements in place, like or union employer arrangements in place that no longer existed. We hadn't figured out how to deal with enterprise bargaining yet. And so the union, when I came in, was, I would say, a pretty quiet place. We were in decline, and we hadn't figured out, I think, how to operate in the brave new world.
Was there anything in terms of your experiences of spending time with the American labour movement and trade unions, or labour unions as they call them over there, that you brought with you to when you started working at the LHMU? Because I mean, obviously, the customs and cultural and the norms and the laws in the United States are fundamentally different to what they are in Australia, and you'd think that unions over the US have a harder time than we do. But I mean, even as you just described, we're kind of in the early iterations of the Howard years and work choices, so it kind of felt like that we might be falling off a cliff and getting towards what it was like in the United States. I know it felt like there's always a lot of folks came over from the US warning us of this is what will befall you if you don't get your shit together kind of situation. But I just want to get a sense of anything you brought back from the States that helped turn things around.
I think I brought back with me a lot of confidence about the fact that we can be in a hostile environment, but I've seen what people can do when they are organised. I became the secretary. Became the secretary in 2007, and kind of looked around for the manual in a drawer somewhere and didn't find it. So a bunch of people kind of got together and figured things out. But I think what we figured out was, number one, low-paid workers like cleaners, who are some of the core members of that union, will stand up and they will speak out and they will fight for decent jobs. They will get active. We needed to reorganise the union to focus on, actually having conversations with people about joining the union, which hadn't been something that, had gone on that much prior, which would be surprising to anyone sort of listening now, but that's kind of the way it was way back when there'd been a reliance on closed shops. There was a big focus on leadership development. How do we train our organisers to not just do those sign-up conversations, but to work with leaders and find them to anchor their own workplaces. And we also had to move from what was a fairly sort of generalist model, which again you might sort of remember, where organisers really did a bit of everything. We reorganised the union to have much more of a sort of a specialist focus, a specialist organising team, a specialist industrial team that would help members with their workplace problems, a specialist bargaining team that was skilled up to figure out how to use enterprise bargaining in a way that would work for people. And also, I think critically for our union, a specialist communications and community team as well, because the industrial system wasn't really working for us. And so having building community support and running bigger public campaigns was really effective for us. And one example of that would be the Clean Start campaign, where all of that, what I've just described, all came together. And we were able to go from decline to growth, and from the award to the first ever citywide collective agreement for cleaners, with a big strategic and noisy and colourful campaign.
Internally within the union, did you experience some degree of pushback? Because what you're talking about is, significant structural change to the way a union operates, and unions can be like big battleships, and they take a while to sort of turn around and change course. But I mean, just doing the timeline from when you started at the union to when you became secretary, and also creating those changes, was pretty reasonably quick. But I'm getting a sense, I mean, did you get pushback? And if you did, how did you manage that?
The main strategy really was to bring together a team of people to organise some of the hardest to organise workers who were not assigned to some of the other teams and some of the existing officials. I became a lead organiser pretty quickly of the school cleaners who had been all fired under Jeff Kennett in the 1990s. They'd been direct employees and they were all fired at Christmas in the early 1990s and told to reapply for their jobs as contractors. And the union had lost a few thousand members, literally because they were no longer on payroll deduction and were now in working as independent contractors. So I kind of got that workforce to organise, and it was considered a bit unorganisable. Of course, for all the reasons we've already talked about, they were not unorganisable. They just need people to start having a conversation with them about, what's the problems that you're facing and what are some of the solutions that you have. We brought people in like Luke Hilakari, who's now the Secretary of Trades Hall, Lisa Chesters, who's now the federal member for Bendigo, and a number of people who are still there today. And I think, just describe it as getting a bit of a place in the union to show that it's possible, and then expanding out from there.
Talk us through the Big Steps campaign that has been a great success story, but obviously a long campaign for many, many people. Big Steps. Who are you organising? Who are the group of people you're organising here in this campaign?
Yeah, so the Big Steps campaign was launched way back in 2012, and it's early childhood educators in Australia. There are tens of thousands of people working in early childhood education. A long time ago, they used to just be called sort of childcare workers, and people working in long day care is who we're talking about here. One of the big shifts in the campaign is getting that real respect and recognition for this, overwhelmingly female, 95% female workforce, and getting an understanding that it's not babysitting, and actually it's about providing a program of quality early education and care. These women have been underpaid forever. They have run a huge, multifaceted, long-term campaign to get the respect and recognition that they deserve. And right now, it is an amazing moment in time where they are getting the first part of a 15% pay rise, a historic pay rise that they've fought for, and that the educators and their union, the employers in the sector, and the federal government are delivering via the first ever supported multi-employer bargaining agreement, and that is happening right now. I think it was just yesterday that the Fair Work Commission approved the agreement, which had been voted up by 99.5% of early childhood educators. And really nothing like this has ever happened before, tens of thousands of women workers getting, a really significant pay bump, and doing that through, a new part of the bargaining system that's been set up really to support this kind of endeavour.
Going back to the beginning of the campaign in 2012, what was the problem or the challenges that these workers faced every day in their work, and why did you guys choose to organise these particular workers?
The challenge that they faced really was just chronically low wages. I remember meeting with women at the time, when I was with the union, who would literally say things like, I'm here caring for other people's children, I'm here educating other people's children, and I'm putting off having my own because I just can't afford it. They were on close to minimum wage. They've professionalised over the years. They're qualified, they're dedicated, they're professional. They're on the minimum wage. And one of the big challenges that we had as a union at the time in trying to figure out how to lift this sector up was really that the industrial system was not fit for purpose for a really big feminised industry like this. We were talking before about the growth of enterprise bargaining and what a challenge that had been for unions. Think about a sector like early childhood, 200,000 people, 10,000 or more different workplaces, all very small workplaces. The vast majority of them owned by mum and dad operations. So 80% of childcare centres are a single site provider. And then, think about trying to use enterprise bargaining to do something about that. You would be going sort of site by site for, hundreds of years, really, given how long it takes, and you'd be lapping yourself, around the country. By the time you'd finished one, you'd be starting it again. And the other problem there was that it's federally funded. Early childhood education is federally funded. So even if you could figure out how to use a workplace by workplace bargaining model, which you really can't in a big sector like that, those operators really can't make the decision on their own because they need to know whether the outcome is going to be funded by government. So coming into 2022, I think the educators had done a whole lot of things, which we've just glossed over, but had done a whole lot of things to build support and recognition. And I think they'd won the argument already that, yes, they should be paid more. So when we came into government in 2022, the focus really became on fixing the barrier. One of the first things we did at the end of 2022, and it was pretty amazing for me to be in the parliament for it, was the Secure Jobs Better Pay Act, which included a provision that the educators themselves had fought for supported multi-employer bargaining. And the supported part means that you can go to the Fair Work Commission and say, can you help us all deal with this big unwieldy beast of bringing all of this together? And can you also bring a third party to the table, in this case being the federal government who funds it? That bill passed at the end of 2022. Sometime in 2023, the educators were the first group to get an authorisation to use that supported bargaining, multi-employer bargaining approach. And, they've been at the bargaining table ever since, and just concluding now. And it was this year in the May budget when Jim Chalmers got up to give his budget speech and said, we will be funding a pay rise for early childhood educators.
That's huge. Just going back one step, as an organiser, with my organiser hat on, I'm thinking, how do you manage to organise across tens of thousands of workplaces? Like, what was the strategy there, and what was the goal? Was the goal to get as many of those workers in the union, or at least aware of what the union was trying to achieve for them? I mean, and the ratio is out of whack, right? I mean, how many organising staff are you allocating to this particular campaign?
Yeah, well, I've been in the Senate for 5 years, so I'm having to cast my mind back to some of those questions. But we had big teams of organisers. I think really critically, it was a national campaign right from the beginning. With a national organising strategy where people could learn from each other about it. But you do have to do some form of strategic industry analysis to figure out where you can build and where you can hold. And in my time, the union tended to focus our organising on the biggest players. So, it's a small proportion of the market, and it is a market because it's privatised provision, which have more than 25 centres from memory, like 1 or 2% of the sector has more than 25 centres. But obviously, as a union, you have to, strategically prioritise, and you start from the middle and you build out from there. I think this is not a sector where you can do things like have an organiser go to the same place every day and sort of sit in a tea room, which I guess is a bit of a straw man version of what organisers might do in a big sort of unionised manufacturing site. But you can't do that. You physically can't do that. So leadership development has always been incredibly important in this, because yes, an organiser can go there and have a conversation with people about what they'll be able to achieve if they join the union together, but they're not going to be back the next day and the next day and the next day. So building and finding those workplace leaders who can actually anchor their sites was critical and has remained critical in this campaign.
What are some of the key strengths of the campaign that you would take with you into another campaign into the future, or certainly the union movement would learn from?
One of the strengths is that this was a national campaign from the beginning, and I say that with my old federated union secretary hat on, where state union secretaries would have lots of different thoughts about different things that happened in a union, but we all came together to make sure that it was a national campaign. You couldn't imagine doing something like this, really, where you're potentially lifting up, an entire sector of 200,000 women if you had several warlords sitting around the table fighting over what they were going to do. So very quickly and from the beginning, making it a national campaign with one organising strategy, one bargaining strategy, one political strategy, one communication strategy, I think was critical. I think this is a pretty obvious one for you, and I'm sure I'm not the first person to say this on your show, but I mean, the educators were front and centre in everything. I think if people know about the Big Steps campaign, or they think, they shut their eyes and think about early childhood education, they'll probably picture, a woman in a blue Big Steps shirt. When I was still at the union in 2018, they walked off the job like 6 times. It was a coalition government. There was no commitment to fund a pay rise. There was no commitment to reform the laws so that they were actually fit for purpose for a big feminised sector. And these women, they were truly amazing. They were the spokespeople of the campaign. They did, the project and 60 Minutes and commercial radio. I remember those rallies, in Federation Square. There were almost as many parents there as there were educators, because these women had done such an amazing job of building the case, because they were the very best spokespeople to say, we love what we do, but love is not paying the rent for us right now. I don't think anyone disagreed with the case that they made, because they made it so well. So I think the educators being, absolutely front and centre was, if I was to pick one thing, would be the most winning part of the strategy.
I'm assuming too that those leaders that you identified, some of them may have then gone on to take on organising roles within the union as well. So it's actually a pipeline for, future staff or workers within the union structure itself.
Absolutely. I mean, I just spoke yesterday to the national organising coordinator, who was she was a member of the union in in Werribee, and we had a big member organising program as well, where we, book people off the job by arrangement with employers. And she came on as a member organiser. She was on our union executive and council as well. And eventually, I remember saying to her, it's you're an amazing leader, and we need you to share that with many more people. Come and work with us as an organiser. And she took a lot of convincing at the time, but it was that because she was so passionate about the sector and wanting to stay in the sector, but she was convinced by the argument that she could do more good if she came in off the floor and just started organising, finding more leaders like herself. Then she became a state-based lead organiser, and now she is the national organising coordinator of the campaign.
Love it. What about lessons from the campaign? What are some of the things that popped up along the journey and you're like, oh, I didn't see that coming, and you've either managed to adjust, or things you'll take with you going forward? Because obviously the campaign isn't completely over. There's more mountains to climb. What are some of the key lessons you've learned?
I think one of the most challenging times, which was when I was still there, and I feel I should say again that, I've been out of it from this side of it, from the inside of it for a number of years, but have seen the other side of it in the parliament. But one of the biggest challenges was being under a coalition government. And, people want to keep standing up and people want to keep speaking out. They want progress. But there was really no way a coalition government was going to say, yep, we believe in you. We believe in early childhood educators, and we're going to fund a pay rise for them. What we did at that point was run a equal remuneration case, which was a pretty big and historic case as well, an equal pay case. And, it was tough. The laws were not fit for purpose again for that. Ultimately, the case fell down, and the reason was, at that time with equal pay laws, if you had a group of women who were in a feminised sector, you had to find a male comparator, so a group of men doing very similar work, and make the case that these women are getting paid less than men doing similar work purely because they're women. But that's not how gender inequality works. It works through the segmentation of the labour market, with women in feminised industries and men in male-dominated industries. And so it's not possible to find a man doing similar work.
Yeah, right.
And so one of the things that we've done as a government is change that and get rid of that male comparator. And that was in the same legislative package. And so we fixed the equal remuneration laws that held the early childhood educators back. I'm not sure what we could have done better, but we certainly had a rough time trying to get recognition for the early childhood educators under a coalition government, and used every single tool that was sort of possibly available to try to do that, including, running this big, high-profile case, which, the Fair Work Commission, did not approve.
I want to ask you questions in a moment about your sort of transition to the work, being a member of Parliament. Before I do that, though, I just kind of want to get your reflections on, we're heading into the election next year, the federal election next year. We've just come out of the back of a US presidential election, and I know that one of the takeaways that I had from it is this disconnect between the Democratic Party and the union movement in the United States. They are seen as just another stakeholder, as opposed to the relationship that is within the Australian Labor Party. And I often talk to folks in the States about how significant that relationship is. It breaks their brain when I tell them the trade union movement makes up 50% of our national conference, our decision-making body that directs the way that our party operates and who we select to represent us in public office. Half of that room is full of trade union leaders or members. And for the Democrats, it's like, well, we just couldn't even consider something like that. How is this going to play out at the election? Because you cannot underestimate the good work and the goodwill and the transformational relationships that have been borne out between the trade union movement and in particular, that union and those workers, and the relationship that union and those workers has with government, in particular a Labor government that removed barriers for those workers to achieve their goals. There's an election next year. I guess I don't want to get to ask a question as basic as, is there going to be 10,000 workers handing out on election day for the Labor Party? I don't want to go that far, but do you know what I mean? I think most social democratic parties would kill for that relationship where they've worked together to achieve things, and therefore what is at stake at this election is that we need to return this Labor government, and therefore as a worker I understand that, and then I will do my bit. Just talk us through the importance of that and how that could look come election time next year.
That's a big question, Stephen. I think this government has done its best to deliver for working people. I mean, this is a true believing Labor government that is true to our name, the Labor Party. I've not seen anything like this in my time here, back in Australia for the last, 24 or so years. The minimum wage under Anthony Albanese has gone up by over $7,000 a year. And I think that moment in his election campaign in May 2022, when he was asked, well, are you serious about, raising the minimum wage to be a real wage increase? And, at least in our circles, he famously said, well, absolutely, and has backed real minimum wage increases every year. That was, I think, pivotal because it was him really speaking to our Labor values, and I don't think we've stopped doing that ever since. Wages are moving at record levels, twice what they were under the coalition. And I think in terms of, the area that we're talking about today, these big feminised sectors like early childhood education and aged care, I mean, because of this investment and this change, because of really figuring out how to remove those barriers, we are closing the gender pay gap. I mean, it is the lowest on record. With aged care and early childhood education alone, this is 500,000 Australian women who are being put on a path to economic security. I'm incredibly proud of our heartland Labor values in this government and what we're doing. It's pretty amazing for me to be there at a, given my background and what I fought for outside the parliament, to be in a parliament that is delivering these historic pay rises for these women. I think going to the broader campaign, I've been doing a lot of doors and phones in our marginal seats in Victoria. And I think we're in that period of the campaign, as you would imagine, where people are not quite switched onto it. I think if you asked a lot of people on the doors and phones at the moment, do you know that wages are really moving now in Australia? Do you know we've got pretty low unemployment in Australia? Do you know we've created 1 million jobs since we came into government? Do you know that, women workers are doing really well, and that's a big focus? I don't get the sense that people understand that at the moment and understand the links to Labor. And I don't think I'm saying anything that we don't know and are not sort of saying publicly. I think that it's how you cut through and get to bring people along with those messages, remains a challenge for us, and it's a challenge on on cost of living as well, where we know that people are doing it tough out there. It's a bit of a once in a generational period of, in the economic cycle. It's more than once in a generation. It's like once in 100 years, when you have a pandemic and a post-pandemic inflation bubble like this. Do people know that we have done tax cuts for Middle Australia, that we have done $300 energy bill relief, that, it's much easier to get a Medicare bulk billing appointment, that medicines are cheaper, and all of those things. I don't think that the electorate is switched on to that yet, and that's our challenge in the campaign. And of course, in the campaign coming up, our challenge is to make it really clear that none of these things, whether it's about jobs or whether it's about the cost of living relief, would have happened under the coalition government. They have, opposed minimum wage rises. They've opposed the industrial relations reform. They've opposed the multi-employer bargaining and said they would repeal it. That has given these low-paid essential women workers just a vehicle to advocate for their pay rise. As the campaign unfolds, I think all of those arguments will be in much clearer focus for people, but it's up to all of us to get out and tell the story, make sure people do know that we have stood up for Australian jobs and for people's wages, and that we have stood up to ease the cost of living pressures that they face.
What's next for the Big Steps campaign? Like, where do they go? And obviously, when you're strategizing for a campaign and you've got an election coming up, that plays a critical role in creating urgency for a particular campaign. I'm wondering, I know that obviously you're not involved in the campaign anymore, but do you have a sense of where they're going next?
I think the next direction is to continue to build the number of providers and centres that are part of the multi-employer agreement. And so the agreement covers some tens of thousands of educators today, but there's 200,000 educators in the sector. And so it's a matter of bringing more people into the agreement. For us as a government, we've also been clear that the $3.6 billion that we've put into early education to fund this pay rise is a beginning, in the sense that it's been set up as a wage fund for centres to apply for once they can establish how they're going to pay the wages, whether it's through the bargaining agreement or some other way. And we've been clear that more reform of how early education is actually delivered is on the agenda. Prime Minister's actually been out today making some announcements about that. But to my mind, an area that we have to look at is to really ask why it is that to fund early childhood educators' wages within the way the system operates now, you've got to sort of set up a special wage account. There's no special wage account, as far as I know, for nurses. It's just part of funding. No special account for teachers' wages. It's just part of how schools are funded. Yeah. So I think the next challenge is, how do you reform this complicated privatised system for a whole range of reasons to lift it up and make sure it's quality, it's simple, it's accessible, and make sure we can include the cost of what it actually takes to provide quality education, which is quality, qualified early childhood educators.
Turning back to you for a moment before we close out, making the transition from being a union leader to the National Parliament, how did that come about? Why did you make that jump?
I did not join the Labor Party actually until I worked for the union, until I'd been working for the union for a couple of years. So I didn't join Labor until I was in my 30s, which probably is not the standard story. Many people joined it a bit younger and got involved in it a bit younger. And I joined when I was at the union because I could see that, people need a whole lot of good things to have a life in this country that is, healthy and sustainable for them. At the time, I think I probably thought, oh, the union movement kind of takes care of the jobs part. But when you talk to people who work as cleaners or early educators or security officers or in manufacturing or wherever we were, they also want a doctor in their suburb that they can go and see. They also want a good school, in their neighbourhood. They also want to be able to retire with enough left to actually enjoy their life. I started to see that we need to change a whole lot of things, and we need to do that, on a bigger stage. The union can't do it on its own. We actually need Labor in government to deliver. And for me, it was just time to do that and to try to represent, working class and middle class Australians, on a bigger stage.
You've chosen the red seats. So that means your electorate's the entire state of Victoria. And enjoying, I read your bulletin, your email that came out, I think it was today actually, maybe yesterday. I see you were in my old neck of the woods. You're up in Gippsland in the valley just recently. What part of the job do you enjoy the most? So getting out and actually getting around the state and meeting folks, or?
Well, while we've been focused on women workers in this discussion, I do spend a lot of time in Gippsland, which I love. I get out across the state and I've been really involved in the energy transition there, and the potential that offshore wind has. You might have seen from my newsletter, I've been to the coal-fired power stations and met with some of the operators and the fitters and turners who work there at your lawn and at your Loy Yang A. And I do love having those conversations. There's a whole lot of public debate, as you know, going on about the energy transition, about Loy Yang A being a potential nuclear site under the coalition if Peter Dutton were elected. There's a whole lot of noise about all of that. But when you go out and actually talk to people who work in coal today, what they say to you is, we know this is over. Like, we are literally crawling through these old dinosaurs to keep them alive. And we just want the most realistic option of a new job, so that we can stay in this region that we love. So I think when I approach something like the energy transition, I'm definitely channeling a bit of the old union organiser and making sure I actually talk to the people who are the most affected. And from that, you learn so much. And again, there is so much noise in the media, in social media, so much, I think, that is negative, whatever your political persuasion. But I definitely still find the best thing is to go and have a conversation with someone and find out what they think.
You raised an interesting point there, the nuclear stuff. I mean, are we worried about that? Because certainly in my day job, I've done a bit of work supporting offshore wind in Gippsland. And from my conversations with folks in the valley who are working currently in the coal industry, they're like, exactly what you just said. We know it's going, but we just want jobs. But in particular, we want jobs in the energy space because that's actually what we're good at. And there's a pride there that people in the valley have about keeping the lights on for the rest of Victoria. And so when renewable energy, particularly offshore wind or battery or solar or whatever comes along, then, if they can work in that space, then they'll want to. Like, as you said, they're not ideological. But then you bring in this nuclear kind of question, there's no reason why they wouldn't say, or nuclear. as well. And that could be a bit of a problem for us with Dutton. And I just, how does that play out in places like the Latrobe Valley, in the Hunter Valley, in areas where there is brown, coal industries that are knowing that their days are numbered?
Yeah, I mean, I've done 3 power station visits, I reckon, in the last 3 months, talking to workers. And not a single worker has raised nuclear with me at all. I'm not going in to talk to them about that. I'm going in to talk to them about where they're at and what our plans are, and the fact that we're setting up the Net Zero Economy Authority, and that it'll be here in Gippsland, and what's the kind of future that you want for yourself, what's the kind of future you want for your family. I think that they have an understanding that the power stations are closing, Yallourn in 2028, Loy Yang A in 2035, and there is no way that nuclear, even if you put aside the fact that it's twice as expensive according to CSIRO this week, there is no way that it's anywhere near ready to go to replace the jobs in Gippsland, 2040 at the earliest. And you really see that when you're at a place like Loy Yang A, which is one of the Dutton sites. People there know it's not going to be decommissioned and have a nuclear plant set up in a couple of years' time, especially when the owner is not interested in nuclear and not going to sell it, to them. So they have all of that understanding about it. As you say, they do want to be in energy generation. They're very literate about it all. And, this is where politics and, coalition politics really lets people down. I mean, there is a future path for them in offshore wind and in the supply chain jobs leading into offshore wind, supply chain jobs in the valley. We have on Friday Peter Dutton, for ideological reasons, saying I'm going to rip up the offshore wind contracts in New South Wales. I mean, this is people's jobs, it's people's lives. There's a plan in place. The best thing we can do for renewable energy and for jobs in the region is to get on with offshore wind.
Geez, it wasn't that long ago that the Liberal Party were lecturing Labor about sovereign risk and tearing up contracts, but evidently now that's okay.
Yeah, good for them.
Brave new world. Senator Walsh, thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed the chat, and I'm glad you came on.
Thanks, Stephen.
Fantastic. Thanks for listening to this episode of Socially Democratic. Like the podcast, hit the follow or subscribe button, and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser, and get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic by following us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn. See you next Friday.